13 years on, the prison in Guantanamo Bay is still functioning despite a pledge by US President Obama to close it when he came to office. What's behind keeping Guantanamo? Can the US be pushed to close it? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. On his second day in office in 2009, President Barack Obama said the U.S. military prison at Guantanamo Bay would be shut down. 6 years later and 13 years after its first detainees arrived, Obama has yet to make good on his promise. Some progress has been made. 39 detainees have been transferred out of Guantanamo in the last year and a half, but more than 100 remain without being charged or having gone on trial. The prison, of course, has become a notorious symbol of the so-called global war on terror. Many of its detainees were picked up in faraway countries, interrogated and sometimes tortured before arriving at Guantanamo to be held indefinitely. Those who run the facility have been accused of widespread abuses, including prolonged solitary confinement. An increasing number of people have called for the prison to be closed. They include the U.S. chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey. He recently said the Guantanamo Bay facility does, in his words, create a psychological scar on our national values. Whether it should or not, it does. As we've been saying, Guantanamo detainees have been held without charge or trial, and rights groups say that in many cases the U.S. had little or no evidence to keep them. In 2011, WikiLeaks released hundreds of documents about those being held at the facility. They showed that of the 780 people held in the prison, only 220 were deemed to be so-called dangerous terrorists. A further 380 detainees were considered low-level foot soldiers or radicalized individuals who had traveled to Afghanistan. But at least another 150 detainees were innocent Afghans or Pakistanis. They included farmers, drivers and chefs. Let's get the thoughts then of our guests on this. In Birmingham, we have Moazzam Begg, former Guantanamo Bay detainee and director of the Outreach for Cage Prisoners. In London, Rob Freer, USA researcher for Amnesty International and a specialist on the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center. And joining us from Washington, D.C., Lawrence Korb, former Assistant Secretary of Defense and Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. Welcome, all three of you. So, Lawrence Korb, if I could start with you then. So we have President Obama. He said on the second day of his presidency that Guantanamo needs to close. The highest-ranking member of the U.S. military says it's got to go. So why are we still here talking about Guantanamo and the fact that it hasn't closed yet?
Because the Congress basically prohibited President Obama from transferring the prisoners to prisons in the United States, and we haven't been able to get enough countries to take them. He's been making progress. He would like to close it. General Dempsey and the military recognize this does not help us in combating what they call, the war on terrorism. In fact, it feeds into the narrative of people who wish us harm. We've also had the fact that when they try some of these people in civilian courts, the local officials, have said no. So it's not him. It's really the American political system, and basically that's what's happening.
Yeah, let's put that point to Moazzam Begg. I mean, obviously, as someone who has spent time in Guantanamo yourself and knows what the conditions were like there, and since then, of course, you've been campaigning on behalf of detainees like yourself. What does this do for, I mean, apart from all of the other issues involved, what does this do for the United States' moral authority in the world when it continues to keep Guantanamo in existence?
Well, I mean, let's look at some of the statistics. There are 127 prisoners still in Guantanamo. Out of those, around 95 are not going to be charged, and about 60 of those are cleared for release or transfer. So that means the overwhelming majority of these people. And what we've seen is that instead of President Obama going through with his promise, he's piecemeal started to release people, as we've seen, as you said, over the past year and a half. About 35 or so have been released. Now, that's a good thing. Just before I came onto this program, I was speaking to some prisoners who were resettled in Uruguay, and these are Syrians and others who were held in Guantanamo for 13 years without charge. Now, just making that statement now in 2014, that people were held without charge or trial for 13 years in the in the custody of the United States of America is almost something unbelievable. It's something like out of the Middle Ages story. And yet, I know Obama has said that he wants to close it, and he's not found enough countries willing to help. But the majority of these people were never charged with a crime to begin with. They're not criminals. And the language still hasn't come through. The language should say that if they've not been charged with a crime, if they haven't been deemed to be convicted in any court, then they are innocent by the law. And that's what the president should have said a long time ago, is that these men are innocent. And that would have supported the idea and made it easier for countries to accept these people, because there's still this stigma that hangs over your head that you're a former Guantanamo prisoner. You must, by definition, be a terrorist.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about that with Rob Freer. I mean, as you and Amnesty International have been very active in campaigning for the closure of Guantanamo, in all of the research that you've done on that, what is it that jumps out at you the most that needs to be addressed here?
Well, I would say that the first thing that needs to be addressed, and the reason, the roots of the reason why this prison still exists, is the absolute failure of the US government to address it as a human rights issue. So Guantanamo was conceived in a human rights vacuum. It's been run in a human rights vacuum, and it continues to be run in a human rights vacuum. It's seen as part of so-called global war on terror, in which human rights were not seen to apply. So under human rights standards, people should be brought to trial, charged, given a fair trial, or released. And the US government refuses now to do what it expects other countries to do, which is to take the detainees who cannot be repatriated immediately for whatever reason. It refuses to take them into the US and waits until another country will take them for it. It wants other countries to clear up its mess for it. It's a human rights failure of the US government, and that's the thing that stands out. A part of the human rights failure also has to be said, it's an absolute failure of this administration and the last to ensure accountability and remedy for what happened to these detainees, both at Guantanamo and before they got there. And with the recent CIA report, the Senate report into the CIA program, there are now, we think, 29 to 30 of these detainees still there who were in that CIA program, who were subjected to enforced disappearance, a crime under international law, and some of them, if not all of them, to torture, which is also a crime under international law, for which there has been no redress and no accountability.
Lawrence Korb, you talked earlier about the opposition to closing Guantanamo from several members of the U.S. Congress. On what basis are they opposing this, given what we've already heard? I mean, what's the sort of, give us a sense of the internal debate that's going on there right now over Guantanamo.
Well, a lot of them, and I don't agree with them, but they're arguing that if you let these people out, they'll go back and join these terrorist groups that are fighting against the United States and other countries. And occasionally some have been released and they have turned up on the battlefield. That's, one of the arguments that they're making. But I think going back to the, and I agree that, the torture was wrong. And again, in the climate of fear that was created after 9/11, you had lawyers in the Bush administration's Justice Department basically saying this wasn't a violation of international law. So, I can explain it, I can't defend it. And I think what's happened, basically is President Obama wanted to do it. Then he lost the 2010 election. The Republicans took over, the House of Representatives. And even though he was reelected, he has no control over the Congress. So it's very, very difficult for him to do it. He has gotten the number, has been pointed out, down substantially. And I think he would like to close it. But again, the political system just makes it impossible.
Yeah, what about that argument, Rob Freer, that if you close down the camp and release these people, that there is a possibility that many of them will turn around and plot attacks against the U.S. and even people who were picked up who were just mere foot soldiers, happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The psychological effect of having been kept without trial for so many years, that's going to harden a lot of people, isn't it? I mean, what do you do about that?
Well, firstly, we're not yet living in a society of a kind of Minority Report like the film, where you basically predict crime and hold people prior to that. Why not arrest everybody in the world and then you can eradicate crime? So, and I think also this thing that keeps being raised about Obama wants to close this and Congress blocks it. That is the most immediate reason why this thing is stuck. But, essentially, these people now are prisoners of politics, of domestic U.S. politics. It's a failure of the administration after Obama's order to act swiftly before the issue became mired in domestic politics. And under international law, there is no excuse for one branch of government to blame another for a failure to meet its international human rights obligations. So they need to work together to resolve this issue, but they need to do so in a human rights framework. And one of the problems that's going to emerge if we're not careful is that they will simply transfer detainees from Guantanamo to the same indefinite detention somewhere else, whether it be inside the US or somewhere else outside of US territory. And that would just be relocating human rights violations. What we said all along is trial or release. And there are people in Guantanamo now who should be tried, who should have been tried a long time ago. And there are others who should have been released a long time ago. We're still at a situation where domestic politics is blocking this.
Moazzam Begg, I know you're coming at us from a very personal perspective, as we said at the top there, because you are a former Guantanamo inmate yourself. You spent 3 years under the detention of U.S. authorities, some of it in the Bagram Air Base and the rest of it in Guantanamo. Talk about, if you're comfortable, some of the conditions that you were kept under there and the treatment how you were treated in captivity.
Yeah, just before I do, I just want to make a point in that the statistics show that the majority of the people that are returned from Guantanamo, in fact, have not been involved in what they call recidivism. In fact, something that we have done, the former Guantanamo prisoners ourselves, is to reach out to American soldiers and interrogators who were our guardsmen and our jailers, and they've come across into the UK and met with numerous former Guantanamo prisoners, and we've tried to build bridges and relations in ways which nobody would have ever allowed. The United States military mission there would have regarded as fraternization with the enemy. So we've actually done things that people have not recognized and not even seen to deemed to understand actually who we were and what we were about. In relation to the torture and the abuse that took place there, I mean, of course, as Rob's mentioned, the CIA torture report mentioned the 119 prisoners who were tortured before they even got to Guantanamo. And by the time you got to places like Bagram, and by the time I was in Bagram and it had finished with me, I was looking forward to going to Guantanamo. I'd seen two people beaten to death, one of them with his hands tied above the top of the cage, being punched and kicked repeatedly. The Americans eventually accepted that this was an unlawful homicide. I saw another person try to escape and get beaten to death. I had my hands tied behind my back to my legs, with a hood placed over my head, being punched and kicked, with the sounds of a woman screaming next door that I was led to believe was my wife. And so these were some of the worst aspects for me. But I have to say that I was only there for 3 years. There's people who've been there for 13 years. I almost feel now unqualified to comment on Guantanamo because of the nature of the length of this black hole of detention. And So when I was speaking recently, as I said today, to somebody who was released after 13 years in Guantanamo, who's now been resettled in Uruguay, he said the torture that happened after I left was worse than before I was there. And he mentions, of course, the force feeding, which is where they are strapped after the hunger strikes. They're strapped to a chair with their hands and their legs and their head strapped down, and a tube is forced into the nose, and liquid food is ingested and pushed into their stomachs. And this is a very painful process. If they turn their heads either side, it can be extremely painful, and they pull the tube back out with blood and pus all over it, and then they insert it back in again if it didn't work. And this is a very torturous process. Some celebrities have tried to do it, and I've seen them start to cry while the tube goes into the nose when they're doing it in a voluntary way. So imagine when it's done by force. So this type of torture, and it is torture, that's being meted out to people who are held without charge, without trial, who are falsely imprisoned, is still taking place.
Well, we're going to try to broaden this out a little bit now, because this prison is of course part of a much bigger U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay. It's been on the island of Cuba since 1903, when the U.S. government signed a deal with the Cuban government. Cuba has wanted it back since Fidel Castro came to power 50 years ago, and Havana refuses to cash the $4,000 check the U.S. pays annually as rent. And though there has been a thaw in Cuba-U.S. relations, most analysts agree it's unlikely Washington will give up the base anytime soon. Lawrence Korb, should we take heart from the fact that there has been this warming in relations between the U.S. and Cuba, and is it a factor in the future of this prison in Guantanamo?
I think we should take heart in the warming of relations. But again, going back to the point that was made, look at all the criticism that Obama got, particularly from members of the Republican Party. And I think this is the first step for us getting rid of Guantanamo. The United States is reducing its footprint around the world. For example, we just closed Mendenhall Base or we're closing Mendenhall Base in London. And I think this would be a very good step, both, psychologically, because as your commentators have said, and I agree with them, it's really a stain on the United States and the values it claims to uphold. So hopefully this will be the beginning, if you will, with our relations with Cuba, of us even having that naval base. We really don't need it anymore. The Cold War's over, and the whole idea of military force in terms of dealing with the threats today is much less than it was in the World Wars and during the Cold War.
Rob Freer, why is it that President Obama hasn't sort of taken a stand and tried to take a position on this in trying to close Guantanamo Bay? I mean, Lawrence talked there about the internal opposition, and you mentioned there the politics of all of this. But we've seen some brave decisions being made by President Obama over the last few months on U.S. immigration and so on, taking some unilateral decisions there. Why can't he do the same with Guantanamo?
Well, he did make another stand, it has to be said, actually, on the issue that Moazzam Begg just mentioned on the hunger strikes. When the hunger strikes peaked at over 100 detainees on hunger strike in 2013, President Obama came out again and recommitted to closing it. If it hadn't have been, I think, for that hunger strike and the fear within the administration that detainees would start to die, we probably wouldn't even be where we're at now. So actually that was a fairly effective piece of campaigning, it has to be said. But the cruelty that is being inflicted, I cannot emphasize too much in the way Mr. Begg has, the cruelty of keeping people in indefinite detention. In 2006, the Committee Against Torture, the expert body that monitors the Convention Against Torture, told the US that indefinite detention without trial is per se a violation of the Torture Convention. We're now in 2015, and there are still people there being indefinitely held. The reason Mr. Obama didn't close it, as I've said, is he let it go in the first term of his administration. I think he prioritized the health issue and let this thing drop off the agenda and allowed Congress to turn it into a political football. And he hasn't found whether it's political courage or whatever it is, to override that opposition. But he needs so to do, because, as has been said repeatedly, the US will be drained of human rights credibility when it speaks about human rights issues around the world every day, every hour that Guantanamo remains open. He needs to get back onto this case as a matter of urgency. His time is running out, of course.
Moazzam Begg, I'm interested to know the chain of events that would lead up to so many people ending up in Guantanamo. Someone like yourself, how you ended up there. I mean, obviously, in your case, you were sort of in the wrong place at the wrong time. But how did all of that unfold?
Well, I remember, look, I was in Afghanistan at the time when 9/11 happened, and we were all evacuating. There was a huge bombing campaign that began by the United States, and people were being sold over. I remember seeing planes flying over, and they were dropping leaflets, as Donald Rumsfeld said, that they fell like snowflakes in December in Chicago. And these leaflets literally offered people for a bounty that they could get $5,000 for each so-called terrorist suspect that they hand over. So this was done. It was practiced by Afghans and by Pakistanis who were poor, who wanted money, and didn't know better that this is what it was going to lead to. It had nothing to do with justice. It had nothing to do with the rule of law. It had everything to do with anything goes. And so you had, as I did, the CIA turn up to my house in Pakistan after we'd evacuated, in the middle of the night, storm into my house with the Pakistan intelligence services, put a gun to my head and shackle me and carry me into the back of the vehicle to some secret location. And I know this happened to hundreds of people. In fact, the majority of people, I think it's 82%, were never caught on what they call the battlefield. They were handed over by different countries and different governments who were told at the time that you are either with us or against us. There were people handed over from Indonesia, from Egypt, from people taken from Jordan and from Mauritania. I mean, the world was your oyster, and everybody was colluding and complicit. I know for a fact in the investigations that I've done that the Libyan government, that the Egyptian government, and that even the Assad regime were complicit in the torture policy and the renditions of handing people over before they ended up in Guantanamo. So it was, everybody was involved, and it was almost like one of these scenarios of Murder on the Orient Express. Is if everybody takes part, then who takes the blame? But the reality, this is something that the United States took on, so it must resolve it. And when it speaks to countries and asks for people to be resettled, it should say that we got it wrong. Can you please help us?
Lawrence, how do you see this playing out then in the last 2 years of the Obama administration? Do you fear that if it doesn't close down before the end of his presidency, it's going to set it's going to set a precedent rather for the next person in the White House? If the man who on the second day of his administration says, I want to close this down, and 8 years later he fails to do that, what tone does that set then for the future?
Well, I think he will continue to try and get the prisoners taken to countries like he just did with Uruguay. And I think that the next president, whoever he or she may be, particularly if it's a Republican, will have more credibility to do it, because what's happened is Obama and the Democrats too often are perceived as weak in the fight against global terrorists. And so we have a saying in the United States called only Nixon could go to China, and that's what you got to hope for. Again, I know that the president tried. Greg Craig, who was his counsel, tried, and he got the Uyghurs released, and then the Congress forced him out of office. I think, in our system, the Congress has a lot more power than you do in a parliamentary form of government, and they have passed laws which says it's illegal for him to do what our other guests would like him to do.
Good to get all of your thoughts, gentlemen, but that is going to have to be the last word. Thank you to all three of you. Moazzam Begg in Birmingham, Rob Freer joining us from London, and Lawrence Korb in Washington, D.C. Thanks very much for being on Inside Story. And that's it for another edition of Inside Story. Thanks for watching. Remember, you can always join in the conversation online. Just let us know your thoughts about this show or any other. We're on Facebook. You can post your comments there at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you can contact us on Twitter. Our handle there is at AJ Inside Story. There it is, the bottom of your screen. I'm Hazem Sika. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.